Well, let's take a closer look now at President Trump's budget and infrastructure plan. I'm joined by Kellie Mejdrich, an Appropriations and Budget reporter at CQ Roll Call. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much.
So let's start with a look at the plan itself. The White House highlights, quote, the unacceptable state of disrepair which damages our country's competitiveness and our citizens' quality of life. So just how bad is the infrastructure situation in the U.S.?
It depends on who you ask, but even engineers, even engineering groups in the U.S. say that there's about a $2 billion deficit just to get things up to a state of good repair. And that's in terms of the roads, bridges, transit systems, and also they're starting to consider water infrastructure as part of that as well.
So what are your thoughts then on the overall plan by the president?
I think that, the $200 billion that the president has identified in federal investment would be a significant investment. However, he, in the budget request that was unveiled today, said that that $200 billion could be leveraged to produce as much as $1.5 trillion. That's a pretty big figure to claim out of $200 million. Or $200 billion. So 1.5 trillion out of 200 billion, that's a big multiplier that you're looking at for the private sector. Another thing that you have to take into account if you're going to leverage that much public investment to generate private building, you have to look at whether there are going to be tolls, concessionary fees, any number of fees where taxpayer groups might argue that the people who are using the roads, bridges, and transit systems are now being double taxed. And that's a huge problem for some user groups.
So this plan does essentially hinge on incentivizing these state and local governments as well as private firms. How would that work, these incentives? What would it look like potentially?
Yeah, so these public-private partnerships, or P3s as they like to call them in the business, it's a very trendy kind of buzzword at this point, but the actual nitty-gritty of how that works is not yet clear. It's very, very simple to envision at a toll road, for example. A private company would pay for taking care of that road, making repairs to it, providing a mechanism by which users of the road would pay for it, and then that would provide a piece of public infrastructure that allows people to go from one place to another. But when it comes to something like mass transit, which is kind of predicated on the idea that you're subsidizing people moving through an area, the user fee and the kind of dynamic between the owner of that infrastructure and the person who's riding on that train, it becomes more complicated. Some people suggest maybe concessionary fees is one possibility, that the government could somehow reimburse a private operator for operating a system.
Right.
So in that case, the user wouldn't end up having to pay.
Because there have been concerns that this plan puts too much power and too much money in the pockets of these private companies and puts so much of the onus on the actual consumers. What's your take on that?
I think that kind of interrogates one of the fundamental questions about infrastructure investment in the U.S., which is who owns the infrastructure? For a very long time, the U.S. has been, as the government, has been the major asset holder. The federal highway system is a huge asset that the U.S. government possesses. And a lot of people in Congress argue that we aren't taking good enough care of this asset as a government. On the other hand, there are some people who say the reason that the infrastructure is so poor is because private companies have not had the ability to unleash their potential when it comes to building out the nation's roads and bridges and transit systems.
And how do you think this infrastructure plan fits in with the president's overall budget commitments that he's looking at?
So that was kind of the elephant in the room, so to speak, when it came to the president's transportation proposal. Today, he offered an investment that would cut the Transportation Department by about 20%. But that was countered by this dynamic public-private investment scheme that would be $1.5 trillion. But that doesn't take away the fact that at the same time, the president is trying to outline a federal budget that is slim, that is trim, and that is somehow reducing the size and scope of federal government that includes transportation. So it's really not clear, and the president has only created the outlines of this infrastructure framework. It's really not clear how that would translate to a transportation department that's been cut so drastically in the 2019 budget.
There's certainly a lot of balancing still to be done. Thank you so much. Kellie Mejdrich there of CQ Roll Call.